Good evening, everybody. This is the third installment of a legal education series for migrant farm workers that is being developed by Justicia for migrant farm workers. While there's often workshops about the conditions that migrant workers face, this is actually a workshop that's primarily designed for migrant farm workers to help them navigate these issues in the context of Canadian law. This initiative allows us to build bridges and maintain connections with migrant communities despite the pandemic. We're going to be doing this evening's workshop in both English and in Spanish. As soon as I'm done speaking in English, we're going to turn it over to Vania and Carolina, and they're going to do the introduction in Spanish, and then we're going to continue with the question and answer series and go back and forth. So it's important to remember that the information that you receive tonight is legal information only. It's not legal advice, and it's not a substitute for legal advice. If you need to speak with a lawyer, Justice for Migrant Workers may be able to connect you with one who can assist free of charge. Now, this series contains workshops with a lot of information that's been condensed into a small amount of time. And for that reason, we'll be elaborating on these topics in future sessions, but we'll also be available to connect directly with you, the workers, if you have questions or concerns and you want to reach out to us in the meantime. Now, tonight's workshop is on racial profiling, what it is, how does it impact migrant farm workers, and what legal remedies exist. And we're also going to talk about, what kind of steps you can take to protect yourself if you end up in a situation where you feel that you're being racially profiled. Now, first, as I mentioned, we'll go over the basics in English, and then we'll do them in Spanish. I'll also do some introductions now as well. Just briefly, my name is Shane Martinez. I'm a volunteer with Justice for Migrant Workers. I'm also a lawyer based in Toronto. I practice criminal law and human rights law and labor law as well. And I'll let my co-hosts introduce themselves also. Carolina?
Oh, hola a todos, mi nombre es Carolina. My name is Carolina Alvarado, and I'm a volunteer with Justice for Migrant Workers, voluntaria con justicia para trabajadores migrantes.
And I'm Vania. I'm also a volunteer with Justice for Migrant Workers. Me llamo Vania y también soy una voluntaria con justicia para los trabajadores migrantes.
Okay, and I apologize, I should have introduced myself in Spanish as well. Buenas noches, mi nombre es Shane Martinez, soy un abogado aquí en Toronto, trabajo en defensa penal, también en derechos humanos, y también soy voluntario con Justicia por los Trabajadores Migrantes.
Ok, bueno, buenas noches. Esta es la tercera sesión de una serie de educación legal para trabajadores agrícolas migrantes que está siendo desarrollada por Justicia para los Trabajadores Migrantes. Mientras que a menudo hay talleres sobre las condiciones a las que se enfrentan los trabajadores migrantes, este es un taller diseñado principalmente para los trabajadores migrantes agrícolas para ayudarles a navegar estas cuestiones en el contexto de la ley canadiense. Esta iniciativa nos permite construir puentes y mantener conexiones con las comunidades migrantes a pesar de la pandemia. Es importante recordar que esto solo es información legal. No se trata de consejería legal ni sustituye a este. Si necesita hablar usted con un abogado, Justicia para los Trabajadores Migrantes puede ponerle en contacto con uno que pueda ayudarle de forma gratuita. Esta serie de talleres contiene mucha información condensada en poco tiempo. Por esta razón, desarrollaremos estos temas en futuras sesiones, pero también estamos disponibles para conectar directamente con los trabajadores que tengan preocupaciones o preguntas. El taller de esta noche se trata sobre la discriminación por perfil racial, qué es, cómo afecta a los trabajadores migrantes, qué remedios legales existen y qué se puede hacer como respuesta. Primero, el formato de esta plática va a ser en preguntas. Primero se va a hacer en inglés y después vamos a hacer en español y así continuamente. Y entonces la introducción ya lo tuvieron. Yo soy Vania, mi compañera Carolina y mi Shane. Vamos a llevar a cabo esta presentación. Okay. Durante el taller pueden enviar sus preguntas por mensaje de texto al número 647-834-4932. O también en la sección de comentarios en esta transmisión en vivo, y haremos lo posible para responderlas al final de esta presentación.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Vania. And just before we get to the land acknowledgement, I'll just mention in English as well what Vania just mentioned is that during the workshop, you can submit your questions through the live chat feed, or you can text them to us as well if you want to send them that way. to 647-834-4932. So that's 647-834-4932. So before we get to the first question, we'll just do our land acknowledgement. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect.
Bueno, y para comenzar vamos a hacer un reconocimiento de la tierra en la que estamos. Toronto está en el Dish with One Spoon. Es un territorio. El Dish with One Spoon es un tratado entre los Anishinaabe, los Mississauga y los Haudenosaunee que les obliga a compartir el territorio y a proteger a la tierra, las naciones y los pueblos indígenas posteriores y Europa.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vania. So we'll move on now to our first question of the evening. The first question is a pretty simple and straightforward one, but it's an important one, which is, what is racial profiling? We hear this term used sometimes in the news and in discussions about what's been happening, especially in light of activism around Black Lives Matter and what's been happening in the US and up here in Canada as well. So in a nutshell, I think a good reference point, a good definition to go to is that of the one that's provided by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which basically says that racial profiling is any action undertaken for reasons of safety, security, or public protection that relies on stereotypes about race, color, ethnicity, ancestry, religion, or place of origin, or a combination of these, rather than on reasonable suspicion to single out an individual for greater scrutiny or differential treatment. Now, this is problematic because when people act on the basis of stereotypes, it can often lead to the mistreatment of others because those stereotypes are not rooted in meaningful, realistic appreciations of individuals and groups that are being targeted. By and large, it's racialized communities, including but not limited to Black and Latino communities that are impacted by stereotyping. Now, stereotyping does not need to stem from a place of malice or hatred. Sometimes people who think they are, doing the right thing can engage in racial profiling subconsciously. In other words, sometimes the person who's trying to rely on a stereotype isn't really aware that they're doing so. They're not doing it necessarily from a place where they're trying to do harm to someone else, but in fact, they may think that they're trying to do something helpful. Now, for this reason, the intention of the person who is racially profiling someone else is essentially irrelevant because the intention really does nothing to lessen the negative and oppressive impact that it has on the person who's being profiled. Now, oftentimes we hear about racial profiling and we immediately think about the police. However, it can take place in a number of other contexts as well. And I'll give some examples of contexts where migrant farm workers could be impacted by profiling. So, for example, being subjected to extra screening and checks when you arrive at a Canadian airport from the Caribbean because of myths that perhaps there's more likelihood that somebody will be carrying drugs from that region, or being followed by a security guard in a store because you're not white when you go into town to do some shopping during the weekend, let's say. Or let's say that you leave the farm to go into town and the police stop you for no reason and start questioning you about what you're up to when you're in town. Also, if you were asked by municipal officials or by, for example, bylaw officers to not congregate in town when there's not a pandemic happening, so kind of putting ourselves outside of what's happening right now, but just during normal times, if, as migrant farm workers, you're asked not to gather in groups in the town, that could be another example of racial profiling. And then finally, just another example to consider is, being provided with substandard housing conditions because it's assumed by your employer that because you're from Mexico or the Caribbean, you're used to those kind of conditions. So those are some examples of racial profiling and stereotyping that can impact migrant workers. Now, racial profiling isn't a question of there being, let's say, a few bad apples. It's really a systemic reality that's well recognized by the courts. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. Now, at the risk of kind of stating the obvious, it does real harm to the psychological well-being of racialized communities and also puts them in increased jeopardy because it brings them into contact with law enforcement and security guards with disproportionate frequency to the majority of society. Now, apart from being illegal, it's also simply an ineffective tool to, let's say, curb crime. Instead of applying tested and proven methods of criminal profiling to investigate, solve, or proactively prevent crime, racial profiling relies on stereotypes, and those really provide us with a mere illusion that action is being taken without really achieving any kind of results that keep us safer as a society. It should also be noted that racial profiling, another way that it's harmful is that it fractures our communities, and it undermines the public's trust in the police and security guards and border officials and so on. And as a result, migrant farm workers, let's say, can become even further alienated from full engagement and participation in civil society. Because what happens when we have racial profiling and this type of stereotyping is that it foments the distrust of the police and of the government within migrant communities, and that can lead to real problems being reported less often, which thereby increases the potential vulnerability of migrant farm workers.
Bueno, y ahora voy a dar la traducción de esa primera pregunta, que es, ¿qué es la discriminación por perfil racial? Según la Comisión de Derechos Humanos de Ontario, la discriminación por perfil racial es cualquier acción emprendida por razones de seguridad o protección pública que se basa en estereotipos de raza, color, etnia, ascendencia, religión o lugar de origen, o una combinación de ellos, en lugar de una sospecha razonable para señalar a un individuo para un mayor escrutinio o trato diferente. Esto es problemático porque cuando las personas actúan en base a estereotipos, a menudo puede conducir al maltrato de los demás, ya que estos estereotipos no están arraigados en una apreciación significativa y realista de la persona o el grupo al que se apunta. En general, son las comunidades racializadas incluidas, pero no solamente las comunidades negras y latinas las que se ven afectadas. Los estereotipos no tienen por qué surgir de un lugar de malicia u odio. A veces, las personas que piensan que están haciendo lo correcto pueden participar en la discriminación por perfil racial de forma inconsciente. En otras palabras, a veces la persona que se basa en estereotipos no es consciente de lo que está haciendo. Por esta razón, la intención de la persona que está discriminando por perfil racial a otra es esencialmente irrelevante, porque esa intención no hace nada para disminuir el impacto negativo y opresivo que tiene la persona en la que está siendo perfilada. Muchas veces, cuando oímos hablar de discriminación por perfil racial, pensamos inmediatamente en la policía. Sin embargo, también puede tener lugar en otros contextos. He aquí algunos ejemplos que podrían ser específicos a los trabajadores agrícolas migrantes. Por ejemplo, ser sometido a un control extra cuando se llega a un aeropuerto canadiense desde el Caribe. Ser seguido por un guardia de seguridad en una tienda cuando vas a la ciudad a hacer tus compras. Ser detenido o interrogado por la policía sin motivo alguno cuando sale de la granja para ir a la ciudad. Que los funcionarios municipales del gobierno de la policía te pidan que no te congregues en la ciudad cuando no hay una pandemia. Y que se te proporcionen condiciones de alojamiento inferiores a las normales porque tu empleador supone que como vienes de México o del Caribe, estás acostumbrado a esas condiciones. La discriminación por perfil racial no es una cuestión de que haya unas pocas malas manzanas. Es una realidad sistémica bien reconocida por las cortes. A riesgo de decir lo que es obvio, hace un daño real al bienestar psicológico de las comunidades racializadas y también las pone en un peligro cada vez mayor al traerlas en contacto con guardias especiales y de seguridad a una frecuencia desproporcionada. Además de ser ilegal, de lo que hablaremos brevemente, también es ineficaz como herramienta para frenar la delincuencia. En lugar de aplicar métodos aprobados y demostrados de elaboración de perfiles delictivos para investigar, resolver o prevenir proactivamente la delincuencia, la discriminación por perfil racial se basa en estereotipos para proporcionar simplemente una ilusión de que se está actuando sin lograr resultados que realmente mantengan a la sociedad más segura. También hay que tener en cuenta que la discriminación por perfil racial fractura nuestras comunidades y también debilita la confianza del público en la policía, los guardias de seguridad los oficiales de frontera, etc. Como resultado, los trabajadores agrícolas migrantes pueden verse aún más alejados del pleno compromiso y la participación en la sociedad civil. La desconfianza de las comunidades migrantes hacia la policía y el gobierno puede llevar a que se denuncien los problemas con menos frecuencia, lo que aumenta el potencial de vulnerabilidad.
Okay. Thanks, Vania. The next question is, how have migrant farm workers been impacted by racial profiling in the past? So unfortunately, there are many examples for us to draw from. I'll share just a few of them to try and illustrate the problem. So one example is from back in October 2013. In that month and year, a person was sexually assaulted in Southern Ontario in a community called Bayham. Now, that was a community, or it is a community, where a lot of migrant farm workers live and work. Now, the person who was assaulted provided a very detailed description of the suspect to the police, including information about his skin color, hair, age, height, build, and so on. What ended up happening, though, was that the police ignored those details, and they instead chose to seek DNA samples from all racialized migrant farm workers in the area. Now, they ended up targeting people who spanned in age from 21 to 61, with heights from 5'2" to 6'5", people who weighed between 130 pounds and 310 pounds. Some people were bald, some had dreadlocks, some were West Indian, some were black. But the thing that they all had in common was that they were all people of color and they were all migrant farm workers. Now, that incident is presently the subject of an ongoing case before the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario on behalf of 50 of the workers who were profiled in that instance by the Ontario Provincial Police. Now, another case we've assisted with involved a migrant farm worker from Jamaica who was sitting on a bench in a supermarket in a town called Tilsonburg. He was approached by the police while he was sitting there with his groceries. They immediately get out of the car, they patted him down, and they demanded that he empty all of his groceries out onto the ground. Scared, and he complied. And then what the police did was they patted him down, they rummaged through all of his belongings and groceries on the ground, and they accused him of taking someone's wallet from a nearby store. He denied this, but nevertheless, they still put him in handcuffs, they put him into the back of the police car, and they drove to the store in this very small community where they alleged that this happened at. Meanwhile, all of the other workers are watching this go on, and the gentleman is very distraught by all of this. Once they got there, they checked the security footage on the cameras in the store, and they realized that, in fact, this individual had done nothing wrong at all. In fact, no migrant worker had done anything. This person's wallet had not been stolen at all, the person who made the accusation. Nevertheless, this is how this individual was treated as a result of the allegations, and only after they had checked the security footage was he released. What we have to ask ourselves is, was his treatment based in part, at least, on racial profiling? Would a person, let's say, who's white in the community, would they have been treated the same way? Now, in July 2017, another example, business owners in a community called Leamington, they tried to get the town council to pass what they called an anti-loitering bylaw. The narrative that was circulating was that when groups of migrant farm workers congregated in the downtown area during the weekends predominantly, that locals felt uncomfortable around them. And as a result, the locals weren't going out to shop. Now, after significant opposition from migrant workers and their allies, the town council declined to impose any such law. But again, we have to ask ourselves, was all of this motivated by something apart from simply people congregating? Did it have to do with the race and the ethnicity and country of origin of the people in question? Another example, last May, during a particularly difficult period in the pandemic, it was suggested by the Norfolk County Health Authority that migrant workers carry special identification cards. It was recommended that this be done voluntarily, with the idea that the special identification cards could be seen as a form of a way for workers to simply identify themselves in the community. However, migrant workers and their allies, at least some of us, felt that this could potentially be a form of differential treatment that could actually reinforce or facilitate stereotyping and profiling. Now, these are just some examples of a larger systemic problem, and some of you undoubtedly have stories of your own. And if you're comfortable sharing those stories anonymously, please feel free to text them to the number that we provided, or you can share them in the chat window. Keep in mind, depending on what medium you use to share them, the information may come anonymously or may come with your name. But when we read it out during part of the workshop, we'll be sure to not include the name, just for privacy.
Thank you, Shane. La segunda pregunta que se hace es, ¿cómo se han visto afectados los trabajadores migrantes por la discriminación por perfil racial en el pasado? Desgraciadamente hay muchos ejemplos en los que podemos basarnos para compartir, pero el día de hoy solo ilustraremos unos de ellos. El primero es el ejemplo de un caso en octubre del 2013, una persona que fue agredida sexualmente en el sur de Ontario, en una comunidad en donde viven muchos trabajadores migrantes. Esta persona proporciona una descripción muy detallada del sospechoso, incluyendo información sobre su color de piel, cabello, edad, altura, complexión. La policía ignoró estos detalles y en su lugar optó por buscar muestras de ADN de todos los trabajadores agrícolas migrantes de la zona. Se dirigieron a personas con edades comprendidas entre los 21 años de edad a los 61 años de edad, con estaturas de 150 a 180 centímetros y entre un peso de 58 y 140 kilos. Algunos eran calvos, otros tenían rastas, algunos eran antillanos, otros eran negros. Lo que todas estas personas tenían en común era que eran personas de color. Este incidente es actualmente objeto en un caso que está cursando ante el Tribunal de Derechos Humanos de Ontario en nombre de más de 50 trabajadores que fueron discriminados por su perfil racial. Otro caso en el que asistimos involucra a un trabajador agrícola migrante de Jamaica al que se acercó la policía mientras estaba sentado en una banca en la calle con sus bolsas del mercado en el pueblo de Tillsonburg. Inmediatamente lo revisaron por arriba de la ropa y le exigieron que vaciara todo el contenido de las bolsas de su compra en el suelo. La policía afirmaba que él había robado una cartera de una tienda cercana de una persona. La persona lo negó, estaba bastante estresado, pero aún así lo esposaron y lo llevaron a la tienda local donde supuestamente se había producido el robo. Después de comprobar con las imágenes de seguridad, se dieron cuenta de que no había hecho nada malo. De hecho, comprobaron que no había habido ningún robo, a nadie se le había perdido ninguna cartera, y en ese momento fue que la persona fue liberada. Y aquí es donde Shane nos dice, nos tenemos que preguntar si la razón por la que esta persona fue discriminada, fue tratada de esta manera, en estas condiciones, era precisamente por su color de piel, y si hubiera sido lo mismo para una persona blanca. Otro caso, en julio de 2017, los propietarios de unos negocios de Livingston intentaron que el ayuntamiento de la ciudad aprobara lo que llaman un estatuto contra la holgazanería. El argumento que circulaba era que cuando los grupos de los trabajadores migrantes se congregaban en el centro de la ciudad, las personas, los habitantes locales, se sentían incómodos a su alrededor y en consecuencia no se sentían dispuestos a comprar. Tras la importante oposición de los trabajadores migrantes y de sus aliados, el ayuntamiento se negó a imponer dicha ley. Otro ejemplo fue el pasado mes de mayo, en medio de esta pandemia, durante un periodo especialmente difícil, dado esto mismo, la autoridad sanitaria del condado de Norfolk sugirió que los trabajadores migrantes llevaran tarjetas de identificación especiales. Se recomendó que fuera un acto voluntario, pero la idea era que las tarjetas de identificación especiales se consideró como un trato diferencial, que podría reforzar o facilitar la creación de estereotipos y discriminación por perfil racial. Estos son solamente algunos de los ejemplos de un problema que es bastante amplio y sistemático. Sin duda, algunos de ustedes tienen sus propias historias. Si se sienten cómodos compartiéndolas de forma anónima, no duden en enviarlas por mensajes de texto al número que aparece a continuación y podremos leerlas durante el segmento de preguntas y respuestas. Tengan en cuenta que si envían la pregunta por medio del chat, puede que aparezca su nombre, pero cuando lo leamos no lo vamos a leer con su nombre, lo leeremos igualmente de forma anónima.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Carolina. So the third question is, are there laws against racial profiling. So the existence of racial profiling, it's been accepted by the courts here in Canada for about 30 years now, the existence of it, not that it's legal. In fact, it's been declared to be illegal. Unfortunately, it's still a social problem that remains very commonplace. If we go back to let's say 1993, there was a case called the Queen versus Parks, and there's a great quote there about how the courts are supposed to recognize racism. So the quote goes like this. It says, "Racism, and in particular anti-Black racism, is a part of our community's psyche. A significant segment of our community hold overtly racist views. A much larger segment subconsciously operates on the basis of negative racial stereotypes. Furthermore, our institutions, including the criminal justice system, reflect and perpetuate those negative stereotypes. These elements combine to infect our society as a whole with the evil of racism. Black people are among the primary victims of that evil." So, simply put, although it's entrenched in Canadian society, racial profiling, yes, is illegal. A number of laws in Canada address actions which are based on the type of stereotyping that typically underlies racial profiling. In the future, we're going to have additional workshops which are going to discuss your rights in the event that you're detained or questioned by the police. But for now, we're just going to touch on two important laws which speak to guarantees about equal treatment under the law. In Canada, we really have two realms of law which prohibit racial profiling. We have provincial law and we have federal law. So looking first at provincial law, Ontario Human Rights Code applies to organizations that are covered by provincial law. So this can include local police forces, private security companies, municipal bylaw officers, and so on. Racial profiling is a form of racial discrimination, and as a result of that, it's prohibited by Section 1 of the Human Rights Code. Now, when there's been a violation of the code, a person can file a human rights application against the responsible party with the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. In doing so, the person can seek damages, which means financial compensation, as well as things which are called systemic remedies, such as an order that there be participation in human rights training by the person who engaged in the profiling. Now, if we look to the federal context, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which we call simply the Charter, is part of the Constitution of Canada. Now, the Charter guarantees a number of specific political rights to Canadian citizens, but it also provides a broader scope of civil rights to every person who's within the borders of Canada, including migrant farm workers. The Charter applies to state actors. So in other words, government, the police, border officials, and so on. It doesn't apply to private parties, though. So for example, security guards at a local store, just an individual that you encounter on the street. The Charter doesn't apply to those individuals in terms of your relationship and dealings with them. Now, a number of sections of the Charter arise in the context of racial profiling. And these include, let's say, Section 7, which states that every person in Canada has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. There's also Sections 8 and 9, which protect all persons against unreasonable search and seizure, as well as protecting them against arbitrary detention or imprisonment, respectively. Furthermore, we have Section 15 of the Charter, which guarantees every person's right to equality without discrimination because of race, national origin, ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, or disability. And as noted earlier, these civil rights apply to everyone in Canada, regardless of their status, which means that you, as a migrant farm worker, have just as much an ability to claim those rights as a Canadian citizen does. And you have the exact same protections that they afford to Canadian citizens. Now, there's additional laws as well, which can apply in particular situations, such as the Canadian Human Rights Act. That's a federal law that applies to, let's say, banks and border services and the RCMP. There's also international conventions, which are international agreements on how countries are supposed to act with respect to human rights and racial discrimination. Now, if you believe that you've been racially profiled, you can contact Justice for Migrant Workers to obtain legal assistance about what your remedies may be. And we can expand on some of this information because, again, we're condensing a lot of information within a small segment of time, and sometimes there's exceptions to the rules.
Gracias, Shane. Entonces vamos a seguir con la tercera pregunta, que es, ¿existen leyes contra la discriminación por perfil racial? La existencia de la discriminación por perfil racial ha sido aceptada por nuestros tribunales desde hace casi 30 años, su existencia, pero es un problema social que sigue siendo muy común. En el caso de 1993, un caso llamado La Reina contra Parks, el Tribunal de Apelación de Ontario dijo que el racismo, y en particular el racismo contra los negros, forma parte de la psique, de la mente de nuestra comunidad. Un segmento importante de nuestra comunidad tiene opiniones abiertas racistas. Un segmento mucho mayor opera inconscientemente en base a estos estereotipos raciales negativos. Además, nuestras instituciones, incluido el sistema de justicia penal, reflejan y perpetúan esos estereotipos negativos. Estos elementos se combinan para infectar a nuestra sociedad en su conjunto con el mal del racismo. Los negros están entre las principales víctimas de ese mal. O sea, en pocas palabras, lo que se dijo en esta corte fue que aunque esté arraigada en la sociedad canadiense, la discriminación por perfil racial es ilegal. Una serie de leyes en Canadá aborda las acciones que se basan en este tipo de estereotipos que suelen causar la discriminación por perfil racial. En el futuro tendremos talleres adicionales que tratarán sobre sus derechos en caso que sea detenido o interrogado por la policía. Por ahora simplemente tocaremos dos leyes importantes que hablan de las garantías sobre la igualdad de trato ante la ley. Tenemos dos ámbitos de leyes que prohíben la discriminación por perfil racial: el provincial y el federal. En el primer caso, en el provincial, el Código de Derechos Humanos de Ontario se aplica a las organizaciones cubiertas por la legislación provincial. Esto incluye a las fuerzas policiales locales, a los guardias de seguridad privados y a los funcionarios municipales, etc. La elaboración de perfiles raciales es una forma de discriminación racial que está prohibida por el artículo 1 del Código. Cuando se ha producido una violación del Código, una persona puede presentar una solicitud de derechos humanos contra la parte responsable ante el Tribunal de Derechos Humanos de Ontario. Al hacerlo, la persona puede solicitar una indemnización por daños, o sea, una compensación económica, así como soluciones sistemáticas, como una orden para hacer que la persona que se involucró en la discriminación participe en la formación sobre derechos humanos. Pasando en el contexto federal, la Carta Canadiense de Derechos y Libertades, también conocida como la Carta o The Charter en inglés, forma parte de la Constitución de Canadá. La Carta garantiza derechos políticos específicos a los ciudadanos canadienses, pero también abarca un ámbito mucho más amplio de derechos civiles a todas las personas que se encuentren dentro de la frontera de Canadá, incluyendo a los trabajadores agrícolas migrantes. La Carta se aplica a los actores estatales, en otras palabras, al gobierno, la policía y los oficiales de frontera. No se aplica a los miembros privados, por ejemplo, a guardias de seguridad de una tienda local. Varios apartados de la Carta se plantean en el contexto de la discriminación por perfil racial. Entre ellos se encuentra la sección 7, que establece que toda persona en Canadá tiene derecho a la vida, la libertad y la seguridad de la persona. También están las secciones 8 y 9, que protegen a todas las personas contra el registro y la incautación no razonable, así como contra la detención o el encarcelamiento arbitrario, respectivamente. Además, tenemos la sección 15, que garantiza el derecho de toda persona a la igualdad sin discriminación por motivos de raza, origen nacional, origen étnico, color, religión, sexo o discapacidad. Como ya se ha dicho, estos derechos civiles se aplican a todas las personas en Canadá, independientemente de su estatus. Esto significa que ustedes, como trabajadores agrícolas migrantes, tienen estos derechos tanto como un ciudadano canadiense. Existen otras leyes que también pueden aplicarse a situaciones concretas, como el Acto de Derechos Humanos de Canadá, que se aplica a nivel federal, por ejemplo, a los bancos, los servicios fronterizos y la Policía Federal y Nacional de Canadá. el RCMP en inglés, por sus siglas en inglés. Y los convenios, también existen convenios internacionales sobre derechos humanos. Si usted cree que ha sido objeto de discriminación por perfil racial, puede ponerse en contacto con Justicia para los Trabajadores Migrantes para obtener asistencia legal e informarse sobre los recursos disponibles.
Perfect. Thank you, Vania. Now, the last question that we have before we get to your questions is, what should I do if I suspect that I have been a victim of racial profiling? So in addition to potentially contacting Justice for Migrant Workers, there's a number of important steps that you should take if you believe that you've been racially profiled, and we'll try and break those down into really 4 essential elements. So first, try your best to remember details about what is happening during the incident. So whether you're being stopped by a police officer or a security guard, or if there's another type of incident that's happening, try your best to observe what's happening around you. Now, this includes trying to remember an officer's name, their badge number, the names of witnesses who may be seeing what's going on, and also taking note of whether or not there's security cameras around which may be capturing what's happening as well. Now, if you believe that you can record the incident, either openly record it or secretly, you may wish to do that so long as you do not believe that it'll jeopardize your own safety. In other words, you don't want to escalate a situation to one where it may cause you harm from the person who's engaging in the racial profiling. So you have to use your own good judgment there. Second, after the incident has occurred, you can immediately write down everything that you remember. Now, if you're not comfortable writing things down, if you're not comfortable with your writing skills, you can instead make an audio recording and describe what took place. You'll also want to make note when you're creating that record of all the details you can remember. Again, the date that it occurred, the time that it occurred, the specific location where it took place, the names of people who were involved, and any other details that you can remember about what occurred. Third, you're going to want to tell somebody that you trust. Now, this can be a friend, a family member, a coworker, it could be somebody at a legal clinic or at a community agency. But this is an important factor if a case ultimately goes ahead to, let's say, a hearing in a legal proceeding. For example, we talked about the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. Telling somebody else can be a valuable step that helps reinforce the credibility of your account because you've related it to someone else, you've shared it with someone else, and then they can explain those circumstances about when you told them immediately after it happened. Fourth, consider taking action. And although it can sometimes be intimidating to think about challenging racial profiling and standing up to the police or security guards or other government actors, it's essential that we speak out when these kinds of things occur. Silence allows violations like this to continue. Justice for Migrant Workers is able to assist workers with bringing human rights applications in the event that their rights are violated. Now, in addition to connecting you with a lawyer who can assist free of charge, we can also provide broader access to a support network to help you with any related issues that you may be encountering. Also, one additional point to note, it's illegal for someone to reprise against you because you've exercised your rights under the code. What does that mean? That means that it's illegal for the police to pursue you and harass you because you filed a complaint against them. That means that it's illegal for your employer to fire you and to send you home because you filed a complaint against the police or against the security guard in the community. So there's laws which protect you as well. Do the police and employers always respect the law? No, they don't, unfortunately. However, the laws are there for your protection, and by linking up with a community agency, whether it's Justice for Migrant Workers or another group, we can help you get more information about what your rights are and also help you access and make use of the protections that are available.
Thank you, Shane. La última pregunta, la cuarta pregunta es, ¿qué debo hacer si sospecho que he sido víctima de una discriminación por perfil racial? Entonces, además de ponerse en contacto con Justicia para Trabajadores Migrantes, hay una serie de pasos importantes que debe dar si cree que ha sido víctima de una discriminación por perfil racial. En primer lugar, trate de recordar todos los detalles de lo que ocurre en el incidente. Esté bien atento a observar todo lo que está a su alrededor. Esto incluye detalles como el nombre y el número de placa del oficial de policía, los nombres de los testigos que están presentes y note si hay cámaras de seguridad en la zona. Si cree que puede grabar el incidente de forma abierta o secreta, sin poner peligro, por ejemplo, su seguridad, por favor hágalo. En segundo lugar, una vez ocurrido el incidente, anote inmediatamente todo lo que recuerde. Si no se siente cómodo escribiendo, puede hacer una grabación de audio en la que describa lo ocurrido. Debe anotar todos los detalles que recuerde: hora, fecha, lugar, nombre de las personas implicadas y cualquier otro detalle sobre lo ocurrido. En tercer lugar, cuénteselo a alguien de confianza. Puede ser un amigo, un familiar, un compañero de trabajo o alguien que conozca de una clínica legal o de una agencia comunitaria. Este es un factor importante, puede ser un factor importante que se tenga en cuenta si finalmente surge un caso legal a raíz de lo que sucedió. En cuarto lugar, considere la posibilidad de tomar acción. Aunque a veces puede ser intimidante pensar en desafiar la discriminación por perfil racial, es esencial que hablemos de estas cosas cuando suceden. El silencio lo único que hace es que permite que esas violaciones continúen. Justicia para los trabajadores migrantes puede ayudar a los trabajadores a presentar quejas de derechos humanos en caso de que se violen sus derechos, además de ponerle en contacto con un abogado que pueda ayudarle de forma gratuita. También podemos ofrecerle un acceso más amplio a una red de apoyo para ayudarle con cualquier problema relacionado con el que se pueda encontrar. Hay un punto importante que Shane resalta y es que no puede su empleador tomar ningún tipo de represalia contra usted cuando usted presente una queja por estas causas de discriminación por perfil racial, bien sea en casos que sean contra la policía o contra alguna persona de la comunidad. No puede tomar medidas de represalia como querer mandarlo de vuelta a su país o despedirlo. Sin embargo, sabemos que los empleadores y no siempre respetan la ley, pero sí hay leyes ahí que están para ustedes para protegerlos y existe información en la comunidad por medio de agencias y clínicas legales que pueden servirles a ustedes como de más apoyo.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Carolina. So it looks like we have a few questions coming in. It doesn't appear as though any have to do with racial profiling, but that's okay. We're going to do our best to answer the questions anyhow, to the extent that we can. I'm going to go through them one by one, and I'm going to speak a bit slower because I want to make sure that because we're doing this in English and Spanish, we just have to take our time with this. So question number one. I've been wanting to know if Canadian employers hire local or domestic professionals over a foreign person with equal credentials. Is there information about it? Okay, so like with many legal questions, the answer is it depends. If we're talking about circumstances involving migrant farm workers, oftentimes an employer is required to first try to hire somebody in Canada before filling the position with somebody from abroad. That's why employers who hire, let's say, seasonal migrant farm workers oftentimes have to obtain something that's called a labor market opinion. And by obtaining that, they're essentially proving to the government that there is a need that has to be filled, that they can't find somebody here in Canada to fill the position, and therefore they want permission to hire somebody from abroad. Again, it depends on the type of job, and it depends on the program under which somebody's coming to Canada. But when we're talking about farm workers, typically there's an expectation that the farmer, the farm owner, prove to the government that they can't fill the position here. And they do that by posting advertisements in, let's say, local newspapers and online, seeking people for the position. And then when they can't fill it, they oftentimes use that as proof for the government to say that they were unable to fill the position and they have to hire from another country.
Okay. Gracias, Shane. Ahora vamos a empezar con las preguntas que ustedes tengan. Las pueden mandar. Ya tenemos algunas, pero no son necesariamente relacionadas con el tema de la discriminación por perfil racial, pero no hay ningún problema. Las podemos contestar. Y la primera pregunta que nos mandaron es, quiero saber si los empleadores canadienses contratan a profesionales locales o domésticos por encima de foráneos con la misma experiencia, las mismas credenciales y tienen información sobre esto. Y bueno, lo que decía mi compañero Shane es que los dueños de las granjas tienen que tener prueba de que han intentado ofrecer el trabajo a locales, pero no hay la demanda necesaria para cubrir todas las posiciones de trabajo que hay. Entonces, lo que hacen es muchas veces publican el trabajo en periódicos y usan eso como para demostrar al gobierno como evidencia que sí, en realidad existe una necesidad de contratar a trabajadores migrantes, y es por eso que los empleadores muchas veces tienen que sacar algo que se llama Labor Market Opinion, que es
opinión de mercado laboral.
Sí, es un estudio que tienen que ellos dar al gobierno para mostrar que pues sí hay una necesidad. Y también depende mucho del trabajo que ustedes estén haciendo y el programa de inmigración del sector agrícola que ustedes estén utilizando.
Okay, thanks, Vania. So question number 2 is, how is COVID affecting Caribbean farm workers who are still in Canada? Great question. As you may know, there's a number of workers stranded in Canada from Trinidad and Tobago. Those workers are in a difficult position, and there's ongoing discussions about trying to get individuals home as quickly as possible. A lot of false hopes are raised and then shot down when information that's not reliable is received, whether it's from one level of government or one country or the other, and it doesn't pan out. It's looking as though some people are simply going to pass the entire year here and then continue working into the next season. But for those who are still here, it's challenging. However, we can say that Justice for Migrant Workers and also other groups that we work with, we have been able to do fundraisers and collections and be able to provide food and clothes and other types of support to workers to help get them through the season. So there are support networks that are there, that are in place, but it's definitely a challenging situation.
La segunda pregunta es, ¿cómo está afectando el coronavirus a trabajadores agrícolas del Caribe que aún se encuentran en Canadá? Esta es una muy buena pregunta. Como ustedes saben, hay un número grande de trabajadores de Trinidad y Tobago que se encuentran atascados en este momento aquí. Es una situación bastante difícil y personas que están queriendo ir a casa lo antes posible. Lo que sabemos es que por momentos como que se da la esperanza de que se van a poder ir, luego la esperanza se la tumban de nuevo. Hay diferentes niveles de gobierno que dan información diferente o de diferentes países se recibe información diferente. Lo que parece es que van a tener que pasar todo el año aquí hasta la siguiente temporada de trabajo. Es algo que presenta bastantes obstáculos, sin embargo, hay grupos dentro de la comunidad aliados, incluyendo Justicia para Trabajadores Migrantes, que han hecho recolección de fondos y de dinero para poder contribuir dando comida y ropa a los trabajadores durante esta temporada, ofreciendo, lo que les queremos decir es que existe la red de apoyo necesaria para poder colaborarles en este sentido, pero entendemos que es una situación bastante complicada.
Question number 3 is, how can migrant workers obtain permanent residence? Okay. Again, a question for which the answer can be quite complicated. I'll try and answer it in the context of migrant farm workers. Historically, migrant farm workers have not been able to obtain permanent residence in Canada. Last year, the Canadian government commenced something that's called the Agri-Food Immigration Pilot. It's a pilot program where they are kind of test driving the possibility of having people cascade through a pathway to permanent residency here in Canada. There's only certain types of workers who are eligible for this. I'll try and go over them slowly. So somebody that's involved in meat processing, individuals who are harvesting laborers for year-round mushroom production and greenhouse production, general farm workers for year-round mushroom production and greenhouse production, also general workers for livestock raising, and also farm supervisors and specialized livestock workers for meat processing, mushroom production and greenhouse production, and also raising livestock. So if you fall into one of those categories, you may be eligible, but there's more conditions that you have to meet. You have to have 12 months of full-time, non-seasonal Canadian work experience in the temporary foreign worker program in one of those eligible occupations. You also have to have satisfactory skills in English or French, one of our 2 official languages. You have to have what's called Canadian Language Benchmark Level 4. Okay. Also, you have to have the foreign equivalent of a high school level education or greater. If you don't have the equivalent of a high school education, you won't be eligible. And you also have to have what's called an indeterminate job offer for full-time, non-seasonal work in Canada at or above the prevailing wage for the sector. So you've got to be, you have to have an indeterminate job offer that you're making the standard amount that workers in that job are typically making. So again, as I mentioned, this is a very new project. It just commenced last year. It's still very much up in the air about how it's actually going to work out, what it's going to lead to. In the view of Justice for Migrant Workers, we respectfully don't think that that goes far enough. We think it's I guess a very short-term and somewhat short-minded solution, and it really needs to be expanded upon. But that gives you an idea about how migrant workers can potentially obtain permanent residence. Again, it's a very basic answer, and the situation is much more complex than that, and it depends on a number of different factors, but that'll hopefully give you some information to work with. And if you need more, you can always reach out to the group.
Ok, la tercera pregunta es, ¿cómo pueden los trabajadores migrantes obtener residencia permanente? Y esta es una pregunta muy complicada y la vamos a intentar responder desde la perspectiva del programa de trabajadores migrantes. Históricamente no ha habido no ha existido la forma de aplicar para la residencia siendo trabajador migrante agrícola. Sin embargo, el año pasado el gobierno lanzó este programa piloto para crear una trayectoria para conseguir la residencia permanente. Sin embargo, este programa tiene muchas... solamente ciertos grupos de personas o de trabajadores migrantes pueden accesar a este programa, y entre ese tipo de trabajadores son los trabajadores que trabajan en plantas de procesamiento de carne, también trabajadores que están trabajando, Carolina, ¿cómo se dice? Livestock.
Ganado.
En ganado, trabajadores que están en el sector de ganado, y también haciendo cosecha a través de todo el año en plantíos de hongos y en greenhouses. Se
me olvidó la palabra.
se me olvidó la palabra.
Continúa, yo la uso.
Ok, en invernaderos. Trabajadores que están en invernaderos. También supervisores. Shane, you say supervisors of farms?
Yes. That's right. So farm supervisors within all of those same areas that we talked about.
Entonces, supervisores de la granja en esos sectores que les mencioné. So, Shane, I said livestock, meat processing, mushroom, and greenhouses. Did I miss anything?
No, I believe that's it. Yeah, meat processing, mushroom production, greenhouse production, and livestock raising. That's right.
Bueno, y además de eso hay otras condiciones como hay que tener un nivel de inglés y de francés, nivel 4. Hay que tener prueba de estudios de preparatoria, de bachillerato. Hay que tener una oferta de trabajo sin fecha de vencimiento y recibir un sueldo que sea estándar, que sea común entre ese sector. Y también hay que tener 12 meses de experiencia ¿en qué, perdón, Carolina?
12 meses de experiencia canadiense.
Que bueno, estoy segura que...
Perdón que te interrumpa, que no sea de 12 meses de experiencia de tiempo completo canadiense, que no sea de trabajo de temporada.
Ok. Sí. Did I miss anything? No, right? Ok, pero también sabemos que sobre este programa piloto que sacó el gobierno todavía hay mucha confusión sobre cómo se va a llevar a cabo y a qué tanto va a llegar ese programa. Y bueno, nosotros en lo personal como miembros de Justicia para los Trabajadores Migrantes, nuestra posición es que este programa no es suficiente y hay mucho espacio para que sea expandido y para que pueda apoyar a los trabajadores migrantes de una manera más justa y sostenible.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Vania. I am staying cognizant of the time. We're going to fit in as many additional questions as we can in the short amount of time that we have left. If your question doesn't get answered, again, you can always reach out to us and we can correspond directly. Question 4, if a worker had an accident during job hours and has to get a surgery, but if the worker had previous illness and the doctor said that some of the issues are from before the accident, could the surgery be denied? In my view, no. If a worker gets hurt on the job and if they need to get a surgery to address the injury that they received on the job, they need to get surgery to address the injury that they have on the job. Protections that workers have here, health and safety protections in workers' WSIB, in insurance protections that you have here, and guarantees to medical treatment in case you get hurt on the job, are fairly strong. If there is a related tangential issue that doesn't require surgery, the hospital may opt not to perform that surgery. For example, if there's an elective procedure that's connected to the one that must have surgery, the hospital may say, well, we can fix one issue, but we can't fix the other. But if the person is injured on the job and that injury requires surgery, then they're entitled to receive that at the hospital.
La cuarta pregunta es si un trabajador sufre un accidente durante horas de trabajo y tiene que recibir cirugía, pero si el trabajador tiene una enfermedad previa y el doctor dice que algunos de sus problemas son previos al accidente de trabajo, le pueden negar esta cirugía. Responde Shane, en su opinión no, porque la persona sirvió en el lugar de trabajo y si necesita cirugía para recuperarse de esa lesión que sufrió en el trabajo, debe recibirla. Existen protecciones de leyes de trabajo y ocupacional, y también con la Junta de Protección y Compensación para trabajadores que han sido heridos en el lugar de trabajo, así también como protecciones con respecto a seguro médico, donde garantizan este tipo de cubrimiento para tratamientos médicos para tipo de lesiones que han ocurrido en el lugar de trabajo. Ahora, si existe un problema tangencial, un problema aparte del que surge con la lesión que sucedió en el lugar de trabajo, puede que el hospital diga, vamos a tratar este problema, que fue el que sucedió en el lugar de trabajo, pero este problema no lo vamos a tratar y le vamos a ofrecer la solución o la cirugía que se necesita para tratar el problema tangencial, pero no el que sucedió en el lugar del trabajo.
Thanks, Carolina. Let's see. Okay, so I believe it's question number 5 says, when you say you can offer legal services, do you mean justice for migrant workers, and how would that process look like? Yes. So when we talk about being able to provide legal supports, it's something that Justice for Migrant Workers strives to do. Can never make guarantees. For example, if 100 people contacted the group and asked for individual lawyers, we probably can't assist with that. On the other hand, if 1 or 2 individuals contact the group with some span of time between the next group of people contacting us for help, we can usually take on requests for assistance. There's a number of lawyers who volunteer with Justice for Migrant Workers. It's not just myself. And assistance typically takes shape when a migrant worker will contact the group. We'll do an intake process, so that involves an interview. We have to get information from them, confirm things like identity, where they're working at, get background information on the problem, and then figure out which lawyer who volunteers with Justicia would be the best one to help out with the case. So then we try to take cases on that way and have people help workers out pro bono. That's usually what the process looks like.
Ok, gracias Shane. La última pregunta es, cuando ustedes dicen que pueden ofrecer servicios legales, ¿ustedes se refieren a justicia para los trabajadores migrantes? ¿Y cómo sería el proceso? La respuesta es sí. Cuando nosotros decimos que podemos ofrecer apoyo legal, nosotros, esa es nuestra perdón, se me van las palabras, nuestra intención, pero sin embargo es algo que no les podemos garantizar. Por ejemplo, si tenemos 100 trabajadores que están pidiendo apoyo legal, es un poco más difícil porque nosotros son más voluntarios, además de Shane, obtenemos más voluntarios que son abogados, pero entonces si son menos personas, entonces tenemos mejor capacidad de apoyarlos y generalmente lo que se hace es el proceso de intake.
Una toma de una evaluación.
Sí, la evaluación principal sería primero hacerles una entrevista, pedir información sobre su credencial, dónde trabajan, tener más información sobre cuál es el problema que ustedes están teniendo y basado en eso ya nosotros se haría la valoración para ver quién sería el mejor abogado que podría apoyarles de manera gratuita, sin costo alguno y sí, así es.
Thanks, Vania. Question 6. What if you didn't work last year? Can you still be eligible for EI? Okay. Again, it depends on what kind of a program you're here under. A seasonal worker is going to have access to different types of supports than, let's say, a worker that's here on let's say, a 2-year permit or a year-long permit. Typically, to be entitled to employment insurance benefits, EI benefits, you have to be employed in insurable employment, so that you need to be making contributions to the system. You have to have lost your job through no fault of your own. You have to have been without work and without pay for at least 7 consecutive days within the last 52 weeks. And this kind of ties into this question about not working last year. You also have to have worked for the required number of insurable employment hours in the last 52 weeks, or since the start of your last EI claim, whichever one is shorter. You also have to be ready, willing, and capable of working each day. In addition to that, you have to be actively looking for work as well. So obtaining EI is not a walk in the park for migrant workers. There's lots of things that you have to to meet, and for some workers, in particular seasonal farm workers, it can be exceedingly difficult and sometimes simply impossible because of systemic barriers that are put up on them accessing those supports. And if you need to repeat any of that, just let me know and I'll repeat it.
Sí, voy a hacer la traducción de la respuesta que ofreció Shane, pero hay un pedazo que quiero clarificar porque no quiero cometer ningún error y la pregunta es muy específica. Shane, when you got to the point where you said exactly about the 52 weeks, and you said something there about required, insurable, and I didn't get that part.
Okay, so the 52 weeks, there's two ways in which 52 weeks is relevant. So first, you have to have been without work and without pay for at least 7 consecutive days in the last 52 weeks.
Okay.
The other way that 52 weeks is relevant to the analysis is that you have to have worked for the required number of insurable employment hours in the last 52 weeks, or since the start of your last DI claim, whichever period is shorter.
Since the last first. I'm going to try my best, but I think I'm a bit confused still.
Okay.
I got you.
Esa pregunta que hacen sobre si usted no trabajó en el último año, todavía puede recibir los beneficios de seguro de desempleo. ¿Es elegible para recibirlos? La respuesta que da Shane es que eso depende del programa. Si usted se encuentra dentro del programa de trabajadores temporales de la agricultura, hay diferentes tipos de apoyo que puede recibir. Si usted se encuentra dentro del tipo de programa de un programa de permiso de 2 años, un programa de permiso de 1 año, todo eso depende. Pero las contribuciones en términos generales a los seguros de desempleo dependen de las contribuciones que usted ha estado haciendo las contribuciones que usted haya estado haciendo al seguro de desempleo. Ahora, hay unos de los requisitos que debe cumplir es que tiene que haber perdido su trabajo sin que haya sido su culpa. No puede ser que haya sido su culpa la pérdida de trabajo. Y tiene que haber estado sin trabajar por 7 días consecutivos dentro de las últimas 52 semanas. Lo otro es que tiene que estar listo, dispuesto y buscando trabajo activamente para poder recibir estos beneficios. Shane anota que esto no es una cosa fácil que los trabajadores agricultores temporales puedan acceder. De hecho, es bastante complicado y a veces imposible debido a las barreras sistémicas. Le quiero preguntar a Vania. Vania, ¿tienes el otro pedazo que es relevante sobre las 52 semanas que no logro capturar?
Solo tengo eso también que dijiste.
Ok.
De los 7 días consecutivos.
7 días consecutivos en las últimas 52 semanas. Ok. Voy a anotarlo con Shane en el privado y voy a aclararlo y al final les dejo saber qué es lo que me queda sin saber. Go ahead, Shane.
Okay. So the next question 7, let me just see here. Okay. Are migrant workers eligible for Canadian assistance? The pandemic crisis has forced them to stay here. Who's responsible for their safety during these difficult times? Great question. Again, given that we have different classes of migrant farm workers in Canada, the entitlements to assistance, they vary. It's not always the same. What we can say is that some groups have successfully been able to obtain pay protection and employment insurance for migrant and temporary foreign workers who have been, let's say, laid off or have become ill, or those who have had to go into quarantine because of COVID-19. So yes, is it possible for migrant farm workers, including seasonal workers, to access supports and assistance as a result of the pandemic? Yes, it is. Those supports are limited, but they do exist. They're not always the easiest to access. And as you can probably imagine, if you don't speak English, they're probably even more challenging to access and in some cases impossible. But by reaching out and connecting with community agencies, workers can access some financial supports. When it comes to the question of who's responsible for their safety, that's really a shared responsibility. Part of that responsibility falls on the federal government, another part falls on the provincial government. And even then, more responsibility falls on local health authorities as well. And of course, a great deal of responsibility falls on employers, who are the ones that are tasked with and responsible for providing housing to workers. And what we saw, unfortunately, last spring was an absolute crisis in terms of workers not being kept safe, contracting and spreading COVID-19 through no fault of their own, by and large, but because they simply weren't being provided with an opportunity to physically distance, and they weren't being provided with sanitary conditions at some of these farms and greenhouses. So hopefully, the next season is going to be starting up again very soon. We're going to see what's happening, but we've got our finger on the pulse of it to try and follow along with what's taking place and to help workers in whatever ways they require.
Okay. La sexta pregunta es, ¿pueden los trabajadores migrantes acceder a asistencia canadiense? La crisis de la pandemia ha forzado a muchos a quedarse aquí en Canadá. ¿Quién es responsable de su seguridad durante estos tiempos? Bueno, y la respuesta es lo que decía Shane, es que existen diferentes clases de asistencia que diferentes grupos de trabajadores migrantes pueden acceder. Entonces, eso varía mucho de a qué grupo pertenezcas, pero lo que sabemos es que ha habido algunos casos de ciertos grupos de trabajadores migrantes que han podido recibir protección, asistencia económica durante desempleo y ciertas protecciones durante la pandemia, o por ejemplo, si han sido despedidos porque han tenido que estar en cuarentena. Entonces, estos beneficios y estas asistencias que hay para los trabajadores son muy limitados y son muy difíciles de acceder. Y, por ejemplo, si no tienes un inglés muy bueno, es más difícil, incluso a veces ha sido imposible. Pero existen agencias comunitarias que pueden ayudar para ofrecer este apoyo. Y sobre la pregunta de quién es la responsabilidad de mantener la seguridad de los trabajadores durante la pandemia, la respuesta es que es una responsabilidad compartida entre los miembros en el nivel federal, provincial, las autoridades sanitarias locales y también los empleadores, que son los que están responsables de dar condiciones buenas de vivienda. Y en la primavera que pasó el año pasado, hubo una gran crisis en donde hubo muchos trabajadores que se vieron infectados del virus porque no tenían las condiciones de trabajo necesarias para mantenerse seguros. Era imposible mantener la distancia social. Y eso es todo. Carolina, ¿algo que agregar?
No, nada.
Gracias.
Okay. Thanks, Vania. Just trying to follow the questions here. Next question. Do you assist people who were unfairly treated and sent home because they fell ill on the job? Yes, Justice for Migrant Workers can help people in those circumstances. So if somebody was sent home unfairly, they were discriminated against because they became disabled while they were on the job, because they became sick, that would be a circumstance in which we would encourage people to reach out and discuss the situation to see if there's something that we can do to help.
La séptima pregunta es si asistimos a personas que hayan sido tratadas de manera injusta y hayan sido enviados de nuevo a casa porque se hayan enfermado en el lugar de trabajo. La respuesta es sí. Justicia para Trabajadores Migrantes puede asistir a personas que han sido enviadas a casa por razones injustas o discriminados por razones de discapacidad o porque se han enfermado en el lugar de trabajo. De nuevo, solicitamos que se dirijan a nosotros y busquen ayuda para poder encontrar las circunstancias y determinar cuál sería el siguiente paso a seguir.
Great, thanks, Carolina. And I think our last question is, what is the EI sick benefit like? Is it minimum wage or according to your pay? Okay, so that's a great question. I'm going to try and simplify it as much as I can and give a very short, simple answer. But EI sick benefits, they can provide you typically with up to 15 weeks of financial assistance if you can't work for medical reasons. That means that you could receive up to 55% of what you would typically earn, up to a maximum of $595 a week. Okay. Now, there's a caveat to that. Back in late September of last year, there were some temporary changes to the EI program to help people access EI sick benefits in light of the pandemic. So what we have now is a situation where for the next year, from September of last year to September of this year, you only need to have 120 insured hours to qualify for benefits, because you'll get a one-time credit of 480 insured hours to help you meet the required 600 insured hours of work that you typically need to activate that entitlement. Okay? You'll also receive at least $500 per week before taxes, but you could receive more.
Okay, Shane, just to clarify, it's people can access up to 15 weeks of financial assistance if they can work because of medical reasons, and that is $595 a week. That's the maximum that they can get, right?
That's right.
And what were the changes that you said since last September to this September? They have to get 120 hours of.
Yeah, that's right. Typically, you need 600 insured hours to access EI sick benefits, but now you only need 120 insured hours to qualify for those benefits, because the government will give you a one-time credit of 480 insured hours to help you get to that point.
Okay.
And I should note as well is that EI sick benefits, when it comes to seasonal migrant workers, EI sick benefits are one of the few EI eligibilities that they actually have, one of the few entitlements that they actually have. Regular benefits they typically cannot access, even though they pay into the system.
Okay. Entonces, la pregunta que estaba contestando Shane es, ¿cómo es el beneficio de desempleo? Y si es salario mínimo o dependiendo de tu paga. Y lo que decía Shane es que, bueno, ahorita generalmente este beneficio requiere 600 horas de trabajo sin seguro, ¿correcto? Pero ahorita por la pandemia ese requerimiento se ha reducido a tener 120 horas de trabajo, porque el gobierno está dando un crédito de 480 horas de trabajo sin seguro. Entonces, ahora pueden aplicar teniendo solamente 120 horas, sí, y poder accesar por 15 semanas un apoyo financiero que equivale a máximo $595 por semana. Sí.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, Vania. Thanks, Carolina. Thanks, everybody who had the questions and for joining the three of us tonight to go over everything together. As we mentioned, this is just one episode in what's going to be a series of legal workshops that we put on. So please be sure to tune in the future. We're going to be putting out a lot of notices about when the next sessions are happening, and we'd love to have you join us then and and discuss more legal issues that are relevant to migrant communities. Thanks very much.
Muchas gracias. Entonces, esperamos que esto haya sido de apoyo para ustedes y durante el transcurso del mes vamos a estar dando más pláticas sobre temas relevantes a los trabajadores migrantes. Entonces, estén checando Facebook, las redes de social media, redes sociales para saber cuándo será otro taller.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, everybody.